Hi, everyone. Hi, Richard.
Hi,
And
Shannon.
hi, good morning.
Good morning from Sydney, Australia here, 6:30 in the morning. I think it's afternoon for you, is it not?
It's an afternoon for me here in Celebration, Florida. So it's great to see you and welcome everyone to this special Q&A session on Ask Richard Ryan Anything. And a few of you may have taken that a little too serious. What we meant was Ask Richard anything about SDT. So some of those questions I can't ask, we'll get back to you. I'm Shannon Hofen, and the director for the Center for Self-Determination Theory. We're based here, as I've mentioned, in Celebration, Florida, and we're a nonprofit dedicated to the science and the research and application of self-determination theory. Some of what we do is bring programs and videos like this to you, so we hope you enjoyed this one. Richard, we had a ton of questions. So we're so glad that everyone participated in this. And I just want to do a quick introduction of Richard, who is the co-founder of self-determination theory. He's also a clinical psychologist, professor at the Institute for Positive Psychology and Education at Australia Catholic University, professor emeritus at the University of Rochester. You're also chief scientist for Immersive Inc., which is a research consultancy group. And you have many other titles, I know. So
Makes me feel tired of hearing it all, Shannon.
you do a lot, but that's part of what's great about self-determination theory is you wear a lot of hats. We all wear a lot of hats in this center as well. So, but it's great to see you again. It's been a while since we've done one of these.
Yes, and I'm sorry it took a long time to schedule this. I know the questions, you said they came in last week sometime, but it takes a while for us to coordinate across continents here, but I'm glad we finally got a time together.
It is, and we did get a lot of questions, so I know we should probably get right to them, but I did want to make a few remarks about them, is that they were from all over, so it just really shows that this community is a global community across many countries, which you'll see from the questions, because I was able to kind of get where some people are from. And also for your information, Rich, and for our audience, I've categorized the questions into kind of three categories. And the first category is they're going to be questions that were more on the theoretical kind of front, people asking questions about the theory and basic needs, etc. And the second group of questions are going to be on COVID and current climate. And then the third category of questions are going to be on applied topics in SDT.
Okay.
So do you have some coffee in hand?
I have coffee in hand, and I hope the questions aren't too hard because it's definitely early in the morning for me, but we'll see how it goes.
Well,
I feel like
here
it's a game show, a game show, and I'm going to get gonged out of here.
it's going to be, let's see if we can stump Richard Ryan.
Yeah,
Is
so,
the name of the show. So with that said, let's get going. The first question comes from Stefan from Northern Ireland. And his question is, are there situations or contexts where psychological needs receive too much support for optimal well-being? So.
Well, I think given our definition of basic psychological needs, I would have to say no to that. I think you can never have too much basic psychological need satisfaction. Given the way we define autonomy, you would think, well, there's never any time you can be too willing to do what you're doing or too integrated in your motivation. More is better in that. And it's also true with competence. I don't think any of us think, well, we could be too competent at something. We might be bored sometimes in an activity where we have so much competence that we can't feel any growth or we can't feel any challenge, but we can't have too much feeling of competence per se. And we really can't have too much relatedness. You can't really feel too cared for or too loved or too much belonging. I think there are times when people confuse, for instance, autonomy and independence. In STT, we think of independence as not relying on other people for help or for guidance. You can be left alone without enough help or without enough guidance, but that's a different question. That's not a frustration of autonomy. That's really a frustration of being left without some resources that you'd like. So, I guess, Stefan, the ultimate answer is no, you can't have too much basic psychological needs satisfaction, but there are other things that you can have way too much of.
And we'll get to that maybe in another question about what you have too much of. The next question comes from Simon from the Netherlands. His question is, in the Netherlands, there's a quote that translates to something like, without relatedness, there is no showing of competence. Others say it can also be turned around the other way and say competence leads to relatedness. Is there one need that comes before the other, or are the needs conditional on each other?
Well, I'm just trying to absorb the sayings from the Netherlands here. I guess on the one hand, I think, there are times when you have a skill or you have an interest in something and it leads you to activities that bring you into connection with others. So, I might have an interest in sport and a skill in sport, and it brings me into connection with teammates. And so therefore, competence is kind of helping lead me to more relatedness satisfactions. I guess also sometimes I can think of, I join a group or I'm connected with some people and they introduce me to some new interests and help me build some new skills. So I could see relatedness sometimes leading to competence. But typically we see them as acting in concert and synergistically. So, we're feeling best in a situation where we're feeling both relatedness and competence. And so I don't really think one comes before another. That said, I think we need more longitudinal data on how it is that certain kinds of satisfactions might lead to more satisfactions. And so I think it's an area of research on how needs act synergistically. But, in general, I wouldn't put one before others. I think they're all equally important, and that's why we call them basic psychological needs.
Good question. So we're just warming up here, Richard. This next one comes from Lucas from Norway. The question is around the difference or similarity between self-efficacy in Bandura's theory and perceived competence in SDT. In yours and Ed's 2006 paper, Self-Regulation and the Problem of Human Autonomy, you equate the two. If that's the case, what is then the difference or similarity between perceived competence and competence as a basic need? Would it be possible to include both measures in a model without being redundant?
Well, there's a couple of questions in that. I'm hearing a couple of questions in that question. One is about the difference between self-efficacy and our understanding of perceived competence in SDT. And in SDT, when we think about perceived competence, it's really a satisfaction of a basic psychological need. And it's something that you experience when you're exercising your skills, you're feeling growth, you're feeling like you're being effective in the activity that you're engaged in. And so it's something that attends certain kinds of activities, particularly those where you're stretching or growing or learning or doing something new. And self-efficacy typically applies to the idea that you can do something effectively. You believe you can engage in a behavior that will get you an outcome. I think we can often feel self-efficacy without feeling any real satisfaction of competence. For instance, when I've already overlearned something, I do know how to open a door, but I don't feel a lot of competence satisfaction when I do so. I know I can do it, so I have efficacy, but I don't feel a lot of satisfaction in doing it. So I think it has a little bit to do with the focus of the two theories. Because Bandura's theory was always focused on, do you have the capacity to do the things that will get you the reinforcement at the end? In fact, his theory says that self-efficacy is a secondary reinforcement that comes about from having been able to obtain reinforcements in the past. And we think instead that perceived competence is an intrinsic satisfaction that's built into us, and it's especially salient when we're doing something new and growing. So I think some of it has to do with emphasis. And that said, a lot of our measures in self-determination theory, when we're asking people, are you feeling competent, or do you have a perceived competence in the situation, sound a lot like self-efficacy questions. So I think if you, just to answer the third part of that question, I think if you put them both into the same model, they're probably going to compete for a lot of variance. There's going to be covariance there, and it might be problematic for a model. I typically wouldn't, of course, I would focus on the satisfaction of competence as a predictor of motivation for doing something. I also want to just make one other point about Bandura's theory and SDT. I think a big difference is that Bandura was clear that he didn't think autonomy was an important idea. He reduces pretty much motivation to the feeling of self-efficacy, and more self-efficacy is better. But we think you can have self-efficacy but still not be highly motivated because you're not interested or highly valuing of the activity. You need autonomy as well. So I think, one expansion, I guess you could say, over self-efficacy theory that SDT provides is a focus on other needs, but particularly autonomy and that sense of willingness for what we're doing.
It's a great clarification. Thanks for that, Rich.
Shannon, I think it's getting a little dark in front of me, so I'm just going to open a curtain here, if you don't mind.
So, yes, this is a recording. I mean,
and that may help a little bit to bring some more light on me. Maybe it does. How's that?
Yeah, that does.
Okay,
it does.
Good.
Okay, great. Okay, next
Not,
to the
not
next
that
one.
we need more light on me, but
I put a little less light on myself. More light on you, less light on me.
Yeah, I don't think so.
So this next question comes from Carolyn from the Netherlands. We've got a lot of questions already from the Netherlands.
Maybe Shannon, because we had our last International Self-Determination Theory conference at Egmond aan Zee in the Netherlands. It was really a wonderful conference. So maybe that's a reason for getting questions from there.
It happened a year ago, like a week or so ago. So I'm thinking of it often, especially right now. This question says, thoughts about positive behavior related to needs frustration. I ran 2 studies with similar variables where needs, satisfaction, and frustration are proposed as mediators, and noted a positive relationship between need, frustration, and organizational deviance behaviors, which was expected. But there was also a positive relationship between need, frustration, and interpersonal citizenship behaviors, which we did not expect. Could you comment on this unexpected relationship result?
What's the name on this question?
Carolyn.
Carolyn. So Carolyn, first, thanks for your question. From what I hear of your study, it sounds like you got a main effect that we would predict, which is that psychological needs frustration in the workplace is associated with organizational deviance. I've seen that result before. So as you say, that's not unexpected. Sounds like your unexpected result was a variable, you called it interpersonal
citizenship. Interpersonal
citizenship. Yeah. I guess here's a place where I could see some association between need, frustration, and that outcome. Because at least in some of the literature, and I've looked at the interpersonal citizenship measurements, they have to do with whether you're polite and kind and giving to other people. But a lot of that is what we might call emotional labor. There's a lot of work that goes into engaging in those kinds of things. And I could imagine in some workplaces where you have need, frustration, you also therefore engage in a lot of things that look like interpersonal citizenship behavior, because that's the surface acting that's required there. That can be pretty depleting. So I don't know. I say that winging it, I would really need to look at your data and the particular variables that you're using, but it sounds like an interesting, surprising result. And the fact that you've replicated it means that there's meaning there. And I guess one of the things I think of as a consultant and researcher, when I get a surprising result like that, I want to go in and inquire with the employees and find out, what did that mean to them? So when they answered this way, what was that relationship from their point of view? We always try to take the internal frame of reference of employees. And so if they're an outcome of being frustrated for them at work in terms of basic needs is leading them to more polite interpersonal behavior or active interpersonal behavior. I'd want to know what that's about. So it's a good question. I wish I had a more definitive answer. I guess I'd have to look closer at the particular context and data set that you have.
And I think that's a good insight, though. The next question comes from Paula from Liverpool, England. She says her question's on behalf of a non-Twitter friend. Can the desire to satisfy basic psychological needs and or the frustration of basic psychological needs lead to situations where group identity and associated extreme values preside over individual eudaimonic values? For example, Jonestown.
Well, I think this is a question with a lot of currency right now, which is, can your identification with the group both enhance or frustrate your basic psychological needs? And obviously, a lot of times when we join groups, we do so because we think they're going to enhance our basic psychological needs. If I become a member of a religious organization or a political organization, hopefully it's bringing me some relatedness with the other people who share my values. It's giving me some sense of mission and autonomy. So these things would be increasing my well-being. But I think sometimes when people have high basic psychological needs satisfaction, they're trying to compensate for that by identifying with groups. And we see this in a lot of identity politics right now. In fact, I think we recently posted a study, Shannon, on the CSDT website that came from an institute. It was Mark Fabian and his colleagues. I forget that they were
Brookings Institute, but you could get
Brookings
that.
Institute, yeah. And in that study, they were showing that a lot of people in the U.S. who've had a lot of frustration around being left out of the global economy and don't really feel like they're making the progress they want to in life, really then compensate for that by identifying with identity politics like Donald Trump and other movements where they can feel part of an empowered mission. And so they're in a way getting a compensatory need satisfaction. And if I think about the people who were in Jim Jones' group, which is the one you mentioned, Jonestown, these were people who, for the most part, were pretty alienated people in the United States, who then joined the Church of Jim Jones, and of course he moved them to Africa for the colony that he was beginning there. And they gave up a lot of their autonomy and they gave up a lot of their competencies in order to be part of a group where they presumably were getting needs satisfied. And obviously he manipulated them in many ways, and ultimately it led to the death of people in the Jonestown colony. And so if there's kind of an ultimate frustration of basic psychological needs, they suffered that. So we can see how group identities can both be enhancing and also debilitating to people's ultimate basic need satisfaction. Many of our groups are actually inhibiting our capacity for autonomy and leading us to conformity and oppression. And so I guess it's one of the things I think we could use more research on. And I saw recently, I think we were talking about this as a Friday post, Shannon Kakanoff and colleagues had done some work on LGBT groups, and people who see people who are LGBT who see their group as having high autonomy actually benefit from that personally and feel more autonomous themselves. So our group identifications can go both ways. They can lead to need frustration, they can lead to need enhancement, and I think a lot of it depends on why we are joining groups and why we're becoming members of them. This is, I think it's a hot area of research in SDT, is this interface between group dynamics and individual need satisfaction. So I hope that answers that question.
Well, these are not easy questions, or at least I don't think they're easy.
And I'm starting to wake up here.
We'll see about that. This next question comes from Eliana from Sao Paulo, Brazil. And the question is, how would you assess basic psychological needs on small children, say up to 8 to 9 year olds?
So this is really a methodological question. Obviously, young children from birth onwards have the same basic psychological needs that we all have. So they have needs for autonomy, needs for competence, and needs for relatedness. And they satisfy their needs through those needs through their exploration, through their curiosity, through their connection with us. And we see the outcome of need satisfaction in terms of the robustness and vitality of their ability to explore, and sometimes what we call committed compliance, where they are willingly complying with parental demands because they're well internalizing what's going on. So, most of the assessments of needs satisfaction in children are observational. So we're setting up situations where we're looking at control or autonomy support in the environment, and we're looking at how children respond to that by greater intrinsic motivation and by higher internalization. I think here of the work of Josime and Margot and others, Wendy Grolnick and others, where they've used observations of children's exploration or compliance with adult requests as outcomes of need satisfying situations. 8 or 9 years old, we've actually used questionnaires as early as I think 5 and 6 year olds. Sometimes we've used even very, very simple questions for them that an interviewer asks and then records the response that they have from them. So there's some ability we have to get self-report at the older end of the age group that you're talking about, but typically it's observational measures. And there's been really a lot of, I think, interesting work in this developmental period, particularly around the issue of willing compliance with demands and internalization. And we see really the importance of parental autonomy support and adult autonomy support in bringing out the highest level motivation in children and also their satisfaction in activities.
Well, so great. This next question comes from Ib in Denmark. What does SDT say about people's biological, physiological needs? How do biological and psychological needs interact? Is one set more important than the other or supersede them in certain situations?
Well, there's a kind of classic view in the field of psychology, which stems from Abraham Maslow. It's called the hierarchy of needs. And in Maslow's thinking, of course, you had to have your basic physical needs satisfied before you would be really attending to and investing energy in the higher order needs for self-actualization. I think SDT really doesn't take that point of view. We say that basic psychological needs are just as important as basic physical needs. They're co-important and they interact with one another. So it's the case that sometimes even at the cost of some of your basic physical needs, you might pursue your basic psychological needs. For instance, I guess the extreme case of this would be some people will sacrifice their lives or their physical bodies for the love of somebody else, or people will neglect their own physical needs as they're pursuing some mission with a great deal of passion. So, sometimes our basic psychological need pursuits will actually override and take priority over our physical needs. But, obviously a lot of times too, we need to take care of our physical needs first before we can really attend to our psychological needs. And this brings us to, or brings me anyway, to think about where the research is now. And there's been a lot of really interesting research recently on the interaction between basic physical needs and psychological needs. Some of that work's been going on in the labs at Belgium with Rachel Campbell. I know Oysel and others have been doing some work on sleep deprivation. And what we see is that when people are deprived of sleep, as I am right now, that interferes with their capacity to really function on the next day and then get need satisfaction. So sleep deprivation can interfere with psychological need satisfaction in the following day. But we also see the opposite and reciprocal effect, which is that if you have a lot of need frustration during the day, that can interfere with your sleep quality and create kind of a vicious cycle over time. So we see interactions between physical needs, for instance, for sleep, and psychological needs that go in both directions. And I think that's really interesting research, and hoping we're doing more of that for all the kind of basic physical needs. I think there's also been several studies looking in really impoverished cultures or people who don't have a lot of resources, and for instance, where there's not physical safety or there's not good nutrition, and whether in those contexts basic psychological needs don't matter. And I think the answer to that is they still matter. They matter a lot, even in contexts where you're not getting your basic physical needs met. There was a study recently in Malawi, I think, that was published on this, where they were looking at adolescent girls and who had some struggles with basic physical needs, but even so, their well-being was still predicted by basic psychological needs in addition. So both matter. I don't think we think that there's a hierarchy. I think we think they interact, though, in predicting people's ability to function and get gratification.
Well, speaking of sleep deprivation, do you have some caffeine in hand? Because we're just getting started. The next question is from Christian from Dresden, Germany. Is it possible to adopt the concept of basic psychological needs to a concept like human dignity? What does human dignity mean in a positive understanding? And GER, its understanding is focused on the absence of extreme burdens like humiliation, degradation, torture. Human functioning is more than this? Question?
Well, that's a really good question, and nice to have a question from Deutschland. I think human dignity is something that's of great importance within SDT. When I think of human dignity, I think like the questioner does, it's more than just the absence of freedom from torture and freedom from fear and freedom from oppression. It's also about the respect for the intrinsic worth of people. And so when I think about how we might define dignity, we would say, I think it would be this idea of we respect that individuals have an intrinsic worth, that they have their own point of view, that they deserve, therefore, respect for autonomy. And so within SDT, respect for autonomy, I think, goes a long way toward conveying to people that they also have dignity. So, I think SDT tries to advance the cause of human dignity by advocating for respect for autonomy for all people in all positions. So whether you're an employee in an organization or whether you're a citizen within a political system, everybody deserves in some way the respect for their autonomy. They have that right. And a lot of the work that we've been doing recently here at the Institute for Positive Psychology has been on what we call people's primary goods, or their perceptions that they have rights and privileges within their society. And our data is showing that when you believe that you are treated with dignity within your culture, that actually is conducive to the satisfaction of basic psychological needs and more flourishing within that culture. And I think given current events, especially in my country, in the United States, although I'm here in Australia now, we can see that a lot of times people are not treated with human dignity. They are oppressed. They are not treated as people with rights and privileges, and there's a huge cost to that for the whole culture, not just for the people who are oppressed, but everyone in a culture suffers when there is not respect for human dignity. So I think it's a really important question. I'd love to see more work on this interface between rights and privileges and people's ability to flourish. But it's pretty clear that in SDT we support everybody's flourishing, and we do so by respecting the dignity that they have and their basic psychological needs as a part of that.
These are really great questions, so thank you, everyone. This next question comes from Pascal or Pascali. I was wondering if you could clarify two things regarding motivation. The first question is, how would you classify cases in which someone is motivated away from something and actively avoids it, either spontaneous, like when we move away from something scary, or more reflectively? And there's a question too, but I don't know if you want to take that or hear the next one. I'll give you the next one and you can process one in the meantime. The next one is, SDT takes intrinsic and extrinsic motivation to be mutually exclusive.
Well, let's do the first one then.
We'll do the
um, if I'm recalling the question here, it was what about the motivation for moving away from something, or what we would call avoidance motivation? And I think there are a lot of things that we're motivated to avoid. We're motivated to avoid things that are really scary to us. For instance, a ghost jumps out of a closet and we run, which is kind of an automatic motivation, and that would be avoidance motivation. And we're also drawn to things, which would be approach motivation. And when I think about that from an SDT point of view, we don't think that there's any strong relationship between avoidance and control, for instance, and approach and autonomy. You can be autonomously motivated to avoid something, and you can be autonomously motivated to approach something, and vice versa. For instance, I might think that there's a scary street in my city that is dangerous to go down, and reflectively and autonomously, I might choose, I'm not going to take that street, or I'm not going to use that shortcut to go someplace. That would be a case of autonomous avoidance of something. But I also might be afraid of walking down that street because, because of reasons that I haven't really been reflective on. And if I reflect on them, I might think, no, I'm not going down that street for reasons that aren't really clear, and maybe I can change my behavior. So I might go against my fear and try something out. I guess maybe a better example would be, maybe I'll go rock climbing, and rock climbing is scary to me, but I also think I might find it exciting and interesting. And so autonomously, I choose to go towards something where I have some fear or avoidance. I think an important thing in SDT then is we don't equate approach and avoidance with autonomy and control. We see them as different issues, and we can be autonomously approaching something that's scary or not. The idea that we might be afraid of something and automatically respond, though. I mean, we do have automatic responses. If a ghost jumps out of the closet, of course, we run automatically. But then afterwards, I would want people to kind of reflect on that emotion. So I would think, well, okay, I ran away in fear, but maybe I was making that up, or maybe that was I was catastrophizing a situation. I might reflectively now say, that was not the response I want to show in that situation, and I, in fact, act differently next time. And this is an area of research that we call integrative emotion regulation. After we have strong emotions, I think we, instead of kind of compartmentalizing them or just letting them drive our behavior, we try and reflect on them. Are those were those emotions telling us something? And the general belief in SDT is emotions are really important. They are giving us information, and if we can integrate that information, we're going to be able to act with more choice and in healthier manners on subsequent occasions. So I know I'm giving a long answer to what was a short question, but there's no simple isomorphic relation between approach avoidance and more autonomous or controlled behaviors. It can be either.
I think those are really great points that the one question can bring out a lot, right? And I think that might be the way this goes. But he had a second question, and that was, SDT takes intrinsic and extrinsic motivation to be mutually exclusive, but I wonder if there are cases in real life where there is an overlap, like when one is motivated to engage in instrumental activities, at least partly because they thoroughly enjoy them. So I know you have things to say about this.
Well, I think it's not the case that intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation are exclusive. I think, in fact, the SDT's position is that they're not exclusive of one another. We can be both intrinsically motivated and highly value something for instrumental purposes, as in identified motivation, and they can happen simultaneously. So we can be both intrinsically and extrinsically motivated at the same time. In fact, most activities that we do have multiple motivations. So, I might do something because I think I should, and I'm feeling some social pressure to do it, but at the same time, I might find some joy and some interest. So there's some level of intrinsic motivation, there's some level of introjection going on, even for the same event. And that's why typically we measure all the different motives why somebody might be engaged in an activity. And we summarize the relative autonomy as one of the things that we look at when we're looking at when we're trying to predict the quality of their subsequent behavior. So, so I think I can't emphasize this enough, which is we don't see that intrinsic and extrinsic motivation are antithetical. I think it's really hard to be intrinsically motivated when you have really controlling extrinsic motivation at work. So if somebody's externally forcing you to do something, it's hard to maintain intrinsic motivation at the same time. So the extreme end of controlled extrinsic motivation is largely incompatible with intrinsic motivation. But there are many kinds of extrinsic motivation that are quite compatible. And I'm going to have to close the shade again, Jim, because now the sun has come up here in Sydney. I think maybe I can show your audience here a little bit of a sunrise here in Sydney. And so I just need to shut that for a second.
Good morning, Cindy.
Yeah. So. I don't know if that's any better. More?
No, that seems great.
Okay. Here we go.
Okay, there, that's better. The next question, if we're ready, it's from Sharif from Florida, here in the US. There has been a growing research on the effect of external rewards on performance, and that certain stages of performance or certain moderators may lead to detrimental effects in intrinsic motivation. While other points of view see the external rewards may not have a negative effect on intrinsic motivation, it can stay the same. What is your current view on the effect of external rewards or extrinsic motivation on performance and intrinsic motivation? So this is kind of piggybacking on what you just spoke about.
Yeah, interesting. I don't think the point of view within SDT on rewards has really changed much, even over 35 years of research on this. We've always thought that rewards can have different meanings to people, what we call different functional significance. So sometimes rewards can feel like something somebody's using to control your behavior, in which case they can have a negative impact on intrinsic motivation. But sometimes rewards are really just providing you information, and they're also even giving you positive competence feedback or helping you feel valued for what you're doing. And in those cases, rewards don't have an undermining effect because they don't feel controlling. In fact, they feel like they're supporting your basic psychological needs. So it has more to do, it's not about whether rewards are good or bad for performance and for intrinsic motivation. It's how are the rewards being administered and what's the intent of the person who's administering them. And when it comes to performance, I think there's a very complex relationship between rewards and performance. Rewards can, in fact, promote increased performance around certain activities, particularly things that don't require a lot of complexity and don't have to be sustained over time. So they can have very strong immediate impacts on certain kinds of performance. But to maintain activity over a long time, to make, for instance, in a high performance setting like sport, where you need discipline and you need to be working over time, it's going to be good to have a lot of autonomous motivation. And so the way rewards are used to support your activity is going to be really, really important. Again, I guess it just comes back to rewards can be positive or negative with respect to both high levels of autonomous and intrinsic motivation. But they can also be undermining of it when they're used controllingly. And the same is true for performance. Insofar as performance is supported by high levels of a person's autonomous motivation and dedication to what they're doing, I think it's important to make sure you use rewards in a way that's not interfering with that, because there is a lot of evidence tying better performance to autonomous forms of motivation.
Wow. It's hard to believe we've got a lot more questions to go, and these are all so good and so many great points. The next question comes from Paulina from Edinburgh, Scotland. My question is, how does SDT address the long-term maintenance of autonomous motivation? And why would an individual whose basic psychological needs are satisfied find the motivation to engage in an activity decreasing over time?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, it sounds like the idea is if you have all of your basic psychological needs satisfied and you hit a kind of ceiling on that, why would you stay motivated at something? I'm not sure I'm quite catching the drift of the question. Is that it, Shannon?
That is, she's wanting to know if all your basic psychological needs are satisfied. And
I think if all your basic psychological needs are being satisfied in activity, you will be persisting at that and you will continue in it because you're finding it satisfying. I guess there's kind of an implication in the question that maybe if I'm getting all this autonomy, I'm getting all this relatedness and all this competence in a particular activity, over time I'm going to be bored with that activity, or I'm going to find less and less interesting. But to me, that means if I'm doing something over and over and over again, what I'm lacking now is a new set of challenges, a new place to feel more sense of competence. Or if I'm doing something over, maybe I'm losing the sense of why this is important or why there's a value. So actually, that's a sign that my basic psychological needs are getting more frustrated or getting less satisfied rather than they're still being maintained at a very high level. So I think in something that becomes too routine or too overlearned, I don't think it's satisfying to our basic psychological needs. And this comes back to good management and good teaching and good coaching, which is why we're ongoingly introducing variety and new stimulation into a job design or to a set of routines for our athletes or for our students in classrooms, because we know that they will get bored over time. And that's a way of responding to their basic psychological needs. And so this kind of relates to the very first question we started with this morning, Shannon, which is you can never have your basic psychological needs too satisfied. And so I think when you're having them all satisfied at a high level, you're still really loving the activity. You're still really engaged.
Thanks for making that point. This next question comes from Jacob. Question is connected to the brief reference to epistemic emotions in your April article on the present and future of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. How might specific beliefs and complexes of beliefs, meanplexes, relate to locus of causality and experiences of need satisfaction? What might it mean for SDT research to consider the effects of belief systems at a granular level?
Did you use the word memeplexes?
That was the word. I hope, yes.
So a memeplex is a term that really comes from anthropology and evolutionary psychology and refers to a complex of belief, like a religious system might be a memeplex. It's a belief system in which people invest and evolves within a particular culture. And I think, the general theorizing around that is memeplexes they help people adapt. And I guess in SDT, we would say that memeplexes can be vehicles for basic psychological need satisfaction. So for instance, a religious system, presumably provides you with a sense of meaning and mission and values, which could support basic psychological needs for autonomy. It can bring you into a group and sense of belonging with others and a shared identity, which would be satisfying for relatedness and helps you understand the world around you, which would be related to competence. So a memeplex, when it's functioning well within a culture, would be helping people flourish through the basic psychological needs. So the needs would be mediators of the relationship of memeplexes to the flourishing outcomes of human beings. But I think it's pretty obvious too that we can have memeplexes that are actually interfering with our basic psychological needs. So we could invest in a belief system that actually inhibits us from expressing ourselves or creates social relationships that are really oppressive. So, Tim Castro and I a long time ago wrote an article about the belief systems that underlie Anglo-American capitalism and how it kind of orients people to focus on social comparison and on materialism and on issues that ultimately interfere with the satisfaction of their basic psychological needs. So memeplexes are parts of our culture that can be conducive to flourishing or can be interfering with flourishing depending on how they impact our needs. And I think that's why we have to look critically at our belief systems. So reflectively, we can look at our belief systems and how they're functioning for us and how they're functioning for other people. And that's one of the, I guess, human capacities we have, is to reflect on our own values and make judgments about them. That's the essence of our capacities for autonomy and freedom. And so I think, is who asked the question? What's the name?
Jacob.
I think, Jacob, one of the things we can be doing a lot more is, I think you put it as granular research on how belief systems interface with basic psychological needs, satisfaction, and flourishing. I think that granular research would look at these pathways through which a particular belief system is maximizing some satisfactions and inhibiting others, and then also how people are motivated to join it. As we talked about earlier, there's a lot of people who are in a compensatory way getting on board with identity politics and belief systems that really probably aren't serving them well, but they're doing it out of motives that are what we would call controlled or introjected motives. And that's part of the explanation as to why they're not fully functioning. So it's a great area for research, and Jacob, I hope you press on in that area.
Oh, well, we're going to turn to some goal content theory question. This question is from Christoph. How would you compare the approach and findings of procrastination research, researchers like P. Still, J. Ferrari, and those of SDT and perhaps of goal setting theory?
That's the end of the question.
The end of the question. I can repeat any questions because
so I don't know the particular work of the people you mentioned, Still and Ferrari, on procrastination, but there's a lot of work on procrastination within STT. And when I think about that phenomena from that lens of self-determination theory, we think of procrastination as a behavior. And procrastination, therefore, can be motivated by different things. So some people would procrastinate because they're amotivated. They really don't care about the activity. And so, I procrastinate on cleaning my house, but maybe I'm just, I'm not aesthetically inclined and I don't really care. In that case, my procrastination is explained by my amotivation. Sometimes you can procrastinate for a different kind of amotivation, which is you just don't know how to move ahead. So somebody gives you an assignment, and you're under pressure to do it, but you don't know how. You don't have the skills, and here you see a competence frustration that's really interfering with being able to move ahead. It's like the helpless form of amotivation. I think more interesting is there's been a lot of work in SDT on procrastination that comes from more introjected motives and particularly self-critical perfectionism. So I'm assigned something, or I have something to do, but every time I get started on it, I don't think I can do it well enough. Or I look at that first sentence I write, and it's just not perfect, and so I put it off for a while. So the self-critical introject, holding myself to certain kinds of standards in that critical way, can interfere with my getting started on something. So it looks like a lack of motivation, but it's really a strong motivation. But the person is kind of tied up and paralyzed inside because of the self-critical aspect to it too. I've even seen some work recently on procrastination where you can kind of look at the curvilinear relationship in procrastination, where people put it off for a long time. That's probably more amotivation or self-critical perfectionism. But there's kind of a medium level of procrastination where you get an assignment and you don't quite start on it right away because you're still thinking about it, you're incubating it. And there's been some evidence that that kind of medium procrastination, where people give something up, they don't just jump right in and start doing it, but they think about it a bit, they're a bit reflective, actually it turns out to produce more creative products. So, ultimately, I think when we analyze something like procrastination, we consider it a behavior. We would look at the different motives that might be underlying that behavior of not doing something or not getting to something. There are, I think STT is illuminating in how different forms of procrastination might be adaptive or maladaptive as a function of the motives underlying.
Great. I feel more reflective now as we do this. Every time we do these Q&A sessions, I feel like that, Richard. So I always love hearing what you have to say, and I think others do too. The next question comes from Natalia from Valencia, Spain. She's a PhD student from the University of Valencia, Spain, and I'm interested in the goal content theory. Therefore, my questions are related within it. She's got two questions. We'll start with the first. In Martella, Bradshaw, and Ryan 2019 article, the dimension of personal growth was excluded because of its similarities with the new dimensions of mastery and self-expression. Do we have to assume that personal growth would be covered by these two new categories?
And that's
well,
the article that she's referring to, well, first I want to encourage her to do her research on goal content theory. I think it's a really important area of SDT theorizing. And for those who may not know, the acronym on this goal content theory is, the idea that we can have certain aspirations or long-term goals that can either be need satisfying and therefore help us flourish, or we can have long-term goals that actually interfere with our need satisfaction. And we divide those into intrinsic and extrinsic goal categories, with intrinsic goals being highly need satisfying and therefore conducive to flourishing. And these are goals like giving to your community, or having a goal of learning and growing, the personal growth one that the questioner mentions, or having the goal of having loving relationships in your life. These things are likely to lead you to greater need satisfaction and then conduce to well-being. On the other hand, goals like accumulating a lot of money or getting famous tend to interfere with basic psychological need satisfaction and therefore not be supportive or facilitating of well-being. The particular question had to do with the mastery goal, I guess, right? And we broke that down in an article into self-expression and something else. What do we do? What were we?
Well, so the question is the dimension of personal growth, and in your article that you wrote recently is that you have these two new dimensions of mastery and self-expression, and is that covered by personal growth?
Well, I think this was just a measurement issue when we were developing the ones for personal growth and expression. The items overlap too much, so there would have been too much covariance, and so we were just using a kind of more differentiated set of dimensions to look at the same general area. There was a larger point to that article. What we were trying to do in that article is to show you could take any aspiration and really map it into the intrinsic extrinsic goal circumplex. And so by breaking out self-expression, for instance, we were trying to show if you were interested in self-expression, you could look at it within this map, and it turns out self-expression turns out to be a highly intrinsic goal and therefore conducive to well-being. And so we could take any number of new goals and place them within that map. And so what we were trying to do in that article is to show, using new methods like multidimensional scaling and network analyses, how you could visualize different aspirations within that conceptual framework. There was no real magic when Tim Kasser and I started the goal contents theory back in the 90s. We were really focused on the goals of personal growth and affiliation and giving to your community as intrinsic goals, and we were really focused on money, appearance, and fame as extrinsic goals. But there are many other goals that could be added into these things, and then some goals that are ambiguous in terms of where they would fall, and that's just an area for new research. I think what we were trying to do is invite people to think about other aspirations besides the original set that we were interested in, and see how they might be placed and function within that conceptual map. So no particular magic to any of these goals. I think there's personal growth still remains important, even if we labeled it differently.
Great. So she has a second question about popularity dimension. So popularity is defined as being famous or admired, but other authors sometimes use social recognition. instead of popularity, such as Sabir, Standage, and Finstinkist in a 2008 in physical exercise context. Social recognition is defined as being recognized and admired by others. Is the goal of popularity the same as the goal of social recognition?
Well, again, I think these are different investigators are using different labels and maybe slightly different measurements of aspirations, and then looking at what their impact is. The main point here for both social recognition and popularity would be that insofar as you are seeking to get admiration from other people, you're setting yourself up for an extrinsic goal that's likely to be associated with controlling motivations and also be less directly satisfying your basic psychological needs, rather than, I guess the alternative one would be really affiliating with other people, or trying to do things that are admirable as opposed to trying to get admiration from other people. So when you're seeking admiration, as for instance, somebody with more narcissistic tendencies is, they're dependent on the admiration and esteem from other people, they're going to have more unhappiness in their life, and they're going to feel more controlled on different occasions. That doesn't mean, of course, that social recognition in the general sense is bad for people. It's nice to be recognized. It's something that can be fulfilling for your competence, because people are appreciating the efforts you put in or the accomplishments that you've done. But if you're doing those things in order to get self-recognition, that's when it becomes an extrinsic goal. So when Sabir and Standage and Van Stinkist were doing their article, I think they were using the term social recognition to really refer to that seeking of popularity or admiration from other people, and that's why it was classified as an extrinsic goal. Sometimes we've used the word popularity for the same thing, but again, no magic here. It's really about what is the goal, and is it about getting the admiration versus is it about doing a good thing and then appreciating the admiration that you might get for that.
Yeah, that's a great distinction. So that kind of concludes our questions on the theoretical nature of things that were coming in, and we're going to move now to COVID.
Okay, how about some easier questions?
I've seen these questions, and I don't think they're going to get any easier.
Let's press on that.
I don't think we've stumped you yet, so we got to keep going. So the next ones, I think, are some really great.
It leads me to a thing, though, Shannon, which is, it is early in the morning. I'm answering the questions as best I can. If there's a follow-up from any of these particular questioners, do send me an email on it, and I'll try and follow up on it. But anyway, I'm sorry. Please proceed.
Yeah, that's a great point to make early on here. And plus, I know this is kind of a casual chat that we're having as a Q&A, and I know you and myself always think of things after the fact.
That's right. Afterwards, I'll have much better answers.
Well, so far, I think they've been great. So I hope the people that are listening think that too. So these next questions are on current events, on COVID specifically, and so I'm very anxious to hear what they have to ask and for your answers to this. So the first one comes from Eliana from Brazil. What do you think will be the impact of the pandemic on our mental health, and what will be the challenges for psychologists?
Well, for Eliana, I know that Brazil is a hot spot right now, so my sympathies to you for all that your society is doing to cope with COVID-19 right now. I know the United States is also a hot spot. Here in Australia, actually, there's very little COVID right now, so the community is opening up again because there's not much community transition. So COVID is impacting people differently in different nations. And so there's quite a bit of variability on that. Before I go specifically to talk about that, I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of research going on within SDT on the impact of COVID on people's basic psychological needs and their wellness during this time. And among those people are Nikki Legate and Netta Weinstein, who are doing some work on government messaging with respect to compliance with things like social distancing and hygiene. We've been doing some work here in Australia on government messaging with respect to people's adoption of a tracing app so that we can trace community transmission of COVID-19. It's been some great work going on in Ghent, and I think this is particularly exciting work where Martin van Stinkist and his colleagues have been showing that social distancing is really a function in many ways of identified motivation. And as people's identified motivation remains high, they are more compliant with social distancing measures. But if they lose that identification and they start to become more externally regulated in their motives for social distancing, their compliance goes down. And they've actually been able to track how government messages have an impact on people's identification versus external regulation, even on a given day. So confusing announcements from the government, for instance, will lead people to deteriorate in their identification with the need to social distance, and then you get less compliance over time. And that some of that's even a function of age, because I think it's a lot harder for young people to maintain a strong identification with social distancing because it's not quite as close to them as to what the risks might be. So there's a lot of good work out there, and I guess the first thing I say is SDT community has a lot to say on this. One of the things about this pandemic is it's forced a lot of people to socially isolate or to self-quarantine. And of course, that can be a real challenge to the satisfaction of basic psychological needs. We have needs for autonomy, which means pursuing the things that interest us and that value us. And self-isolation can, in some ways, be blocking us from doing those things that are our passions. It can also lead us to feel more isolated from other people and interfere with our capacities for relatedness, as well as those for autonomy and competence. So it can be very need frustrating. And I think one of the keys to maintaining ourselves during times of self-quarantine and self-isolation is still finding those things that really interest us. So in other words, identifying valued activities that we can pursue within the constraints that we have in self-isolation, and then finding new ways to connect with other people. I guess, for instance, we're doing this Q&A here at a great distance across continents, but it's a way we can connect with each other as a community. And hopefully that's, adding to our sense of relatedness and mission. So, we have to find compensatory routes or alternative routes really to getting the satisfactions that help us stay afloat and to flourish. And that includes, again, autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And, I think in some ways, if we can see any silver lining to things like pandemics, it helps us bring us maybe a little closer to ourselves and to reflect on, well, what really does matter to us? What are the things that are really important? And to emphasize those things, especially during this time. And if I were to suggest something pretty important, it's about taking care of other people. I think when these times there's a lot of people in need around us, and if we can do things to help them, it's going to not only be a benefit to the recipient on that, but SDT research shows that when we focus on contributing to others, we feel more autonomous, we can feel some effectiveness and competence, and that helps us bring into connection with others and relatedness. So, my best advice in this time is let's think about other people and see how we can help them, and then that happens to also be satisfying to ourselves.
It's a great answer, Rich. We were kind of talking about this. I do want to let the audience know that on our website, we do have a COVID section under topics that they can go to and find some of the studies and resources that you've been talking about. So we've made those available on our website. So with that said, let's move to the next question, and it's from Lada. And what is the best way to cope with a pandemic from an SDT perspective?
Well, I guess I probably already started to answer that question in my last one, which is, again, let's reflectively think about how can we get our basic psychological needs satisfied? What are the things that I really do want to autonomously pursue that I can do within the constraints that I have? And who are the people that I can reach out to and connect with through the internet or through other means? that are both going to satisfy that sense of relatedness and also, I think, help those other people feel connection with us. And what things can we do effectively given constraints? I guess from a philosophical point of view, the world of nature can never kind of interfere with our autonomy. What it does do is interfere with our freedom. It takes away certain possibilities that we have, and we have to look for the possibilities we have within the constraints. I know Behzad Behzadia from Iran was with DC was recently working on an article about how you could have a eudaimonic existence even in self-quarantine, and it was really about how can you identify those personal goals and pursue personal goals that will be really need satisfying within the constraints of self-isolation. I think this is a general existential problem humans have, which is how can we work within the constraints that befall us, which is our facticity, to find satisfactions. And there's both opportunity and challenge here in the time of COVID.
Great. Well, this next question comes from Adam from Saskatchewan, Canada. During
Saskatchewan, yay.
This one says, during COVID-19, many are dealing with restlessness and trying to be productive to quell those feelings. This aligns with introjected regulation, but could it not also be resilience, turning negative feelings into positive actions? How do these constructs overlap? I recognize identified and intrinsic forms of self-regulation correlate with greater resilience and well-being, but does resilience not initially stem from strong feelings, for example, anxiety, that provoke reactions first?
Well, I like this question from Saskatchewan. One of the things about restlessness is it's a sign from yourself that you're not getting need fulfillment. So if you're feeling restless, then there's something that's unsatisfied in you. Maybe you're not getting enough challenges. Maybe you're not getting enough stimulation, for instance. And that would mean by listening to your own restlessness and using it as information, you can say, maybe there's some ways I could find more stimulation or give myself more challenges in life. Or restlessness might indicate that you're not getting the relational needs fulfilled that you need fulfilled. So again, I'm going to come back to recent work within SDT on emotion and regulation that we call integrative emotion regulation. It means if you have a set of feelings like restlessness or irritation or impatience with things, those are feelings that are worth reflecting on and paying attention to. So rather than just acting on them, instead of impulsively just getting up and doing things when you're restless, to take interest in your restlessness. What we'd say is be mindful of it, get a sense of what's going on in your internal and external environment that's associated with that feeling of restlessness and what might be bringing it about, so that you can make the right choices on solving that. That reflective stance with respect to emotions, rather than just letting your emotions drive you around, is really important, and helps people be more choiceful and more integrated in the actions that they do take out of restlessness. Now, if I were in Saskatchewan, I would think there's a lot of beautiful nature I could be going out and exploring at the moment, and I might want to be using my restlessness to prompt me out to have that contact with nature. But again, I'm just joking about that. But let's say that we're restless in self-quarantine. It might mean to say, well, now I got to be proactive and construct some activities that are going to be both satisfying and maybe can contribute to my community to bring me some more satisfactions.
I think those are great points to kind of go along with the first questions that have been asked about this. So,
I just maybe it leads me to just a free association to self-determination theory is an organismic theory, and it assumes that people are inherently active and proactive. We want to be doing things. We want to be active. We want to be exercising our skills. We want to be contributing. We want to be accomplishing. That is human nature. And restlessness is therefore part of that human nature. Hopefully we do get restless when we're not doing enough, when we're being too passive, when we're understimulated. Restlessness is a positive spur to engage our human nature and our capacities to have a more vital life.
Can you, just to kind of go, the question before this was asking about the restlessness and anxiousness. Can you speak a little, just quickly, briefly about the anxiousness piece that people might be experiencing right now, being self-isolated or quarantining or social distancing?
Well, again, anxiety is a signal, and anxiety can be an adaptive signal because it can tell us to be watching out. We probably should be anxious about a pandemic that's out there, and it should lead us to pay attention to things like more hygiene behavior, more social distancing, maybe the wearing of masks, depending on our cultural context. So anxiety can be information that's telling me this is something to worry about. But sometimes anxiety is overblown or catastrophizing or not appropriate to the situation. And again, that's why we do an integrative emotion regulation. We don't push down the anxiety or suppress the anxiety, but we take interest in it, see if there's information in it. And if there's not really information, if it is really that we're kind of overblowing a situation, then we can engage in some things like reframing the situation, or thinking differently about it, or finding areas of comfort. I don't think of anxiety as either good or bad. I think, again, it's information that's coming from our personalities that we should take interest in, because taking that interest can help us in the regulation of behavior. Anybody who's not anxious at this point in time is probably not alive or awake. There's a lot of anxiety provoking
you said that, because I think
around the world. So I would like to normalize that a bit. I think we're all feeling pretty anxious in a time where there's actual threat. And that's the purpose of anxiety, is to help us hone in on threats that are around us. So it's not a bad feeling to have. It's what we do with anxiety that I think makes the difference.
Okay. Thanks for elaborating on that. The next question comes from Wilbert from Hong Kong.
I know Wilbert from Hong Kong. That's probably Wilbert Law. Is that not correct?
I'm not saying, but I.
Oh, you're not supposed to say it. I believe it's probably Wilbert Law, because he's the Wilbert from Hong Kong. Hi, Wilbert. Sorry to review.
Lately, I have read the preprint. Information safety assurances affect intentions to use COVID-19 contact tracing applications, regardless of autonomy, supportive, or controlling message framing. That's the title, and this is your article, right, Richard?
Yeah, it's actually an article that's led by Emma Bradshaw, who works with me here at Australian Catholic University, and some other colleagues. And we did an experiment here, an online experiment, where we gave people different messaging, autonomy, supportive messaging, and a very controlled messaging on why they should use a contact tracing app for COVID-19. A lot of people are reluctant to use contact tracing apps because they feel like they're an invasion of privacy. So these are apps that you would download on your phone that would tell you who you're in contact with, so that if there's an outbreak of COVID-19 in the community, or coronavirus in the community, you can detect where it is and who people have been in contact with, so they can appropriately self-isolate. So it's a really, really useful health intervention to have such an app, but there are also reasons people are reluctant to download it. So we did an experiment to try and see if we could prompt people to do more downloading of this app using different messaging. And in our experiment, we did expect, we were surprised that both controlling and autonomy supportive messaging worked here in Australia. But I have to say, part of that is because I think people in Australia have seen the government's response to COVID-19 is pretty systematic, it's pretty competent, and it's pretty legitimate. So almost in the vast majority of the participants in our study were already prone to do what the government recommended because of that high legitimacy. And so we didn't get an effect for the style of messaging, autonomy, supportive versus control. We did get a main effect, however, for another condition where we made salient the high safety and privacy of this app, the protections that were built into it so that it couldn't be abused, and another condition where that wasn't made as salient, and that had a main effect. People were less likely to want to download an app where they couldn't have that privacy protection. And that's something that Raphael Calvo and I have emphasized in some previous writing, and Sebastian Tuturting. People need that safety from surveillance, because surveillance also feels like a controlling thing in society, and it's something that people try and avoid. We're currently replicating that study in the United States, and I think we'll probably get different results, Wilbert, because I think the perception of legitimacy of the messaging that's been coming from the US government is less high than it is here in Australia. So we're probably going to see less tendency to be compliant with it in general, and probably more effectiveness of autonomy supportive messaging. But that data is not in yet. So yeah, we were surprised by our result. We did put it out into the public anyway, even though it wasn't the result we predicted. We pre-registered that study. Because I think it's important to see that sometimes it doesn't matter how the message is conveyed. If the government's already seen as legitimate and people have good reasons for that they're given for why to do something, they will adopt new behavior.
It's interesting. So
Yeah.
Thanks, Wilbert, for asking that question. Next question comes from Martin from Rochester, New York. Maybe someone you know.
I think it is someone I know. I know one Martin from Rochester is Martin Lynch from the School of Education. But I'm not supposed to be naming names here, am I? So hello, Martin.
Martin wants to know that I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the best thing SDT researchers can do to contribute to society today.
Well, first of all, this is a global seminar, so we've already heard questions from South America, and from Europe, and from the United States, and from Australia, and from Hong Kong, so there's no single answer, because different societies are facing different problems. So what's the best thing we can do, of course, is going to vary a bit by what cultures we're in. But I can't imagine that there's any culture where the best things we can do is to care about the other people around us. I think what a lot of SDT research shows is that when we contribute to our communities, when we care about other people, it not only does good for them, but it also satisfies all of our own basic psychological needs. This goes back to work that has been done by Netta Weinstein, and also work that Frank Martella has done on being benevolent to others. When we act with benevolence, we do good, but it turns out to be good for us. So there are a lot of different issues. I think about the United States right now, and of course everybody in the world is probably aware of what's going on in the United States with George Floyd's death, and the protests that are going on there. This is a time, I think, where treating other people with compassion, listening, paying attention to the issues that are out there, and supporting people for exerting their human rights is probably the best thing we can be doing within our culture, is to support the voices that have been oppressed and help them gain the rights and privileges that they deserve. Going back to our previous question on human dignity. But in different societies, the thing that's the best thing to do is going to vary. So I don't want to give some standard answer for that. It's always going to be about contributing to our communities and to our species and to our planet, and I think that's the best thing we can always be doing. That's what eudaimonic living is, though. One of the underlying philosophies of SDT is a eudaimonic position, which says that if we can live the best life possible, which means live according to our virtues and our excellences and exercise those, that will turn out to be the happiest life, because it will be the most satisfying life. And here again, it's you're not doing good because it happens to have those consequences, but it does have those consequences. And I think one of the beautiful things that SDT research has been able to show is that living eudaimonically does satisfy basic psychological needs and does lead to a happier existence. I hope that answers your question, Martin.
It's a great question and great response. So we're next going to move on to some applied topics, Richard.
Okay.
Some
Let me see if
questions.
I can get more light in here. Hold on for a second.
Yeah, we can take a little break.
I don't know if that's going to be too much light or what, but is that a little better?
That's better. That is better. Do you need to get some coffee before we get
No,
started?
I still got my Yeti cup right here. So.
Okay, take a sip. We're halfway through. So we're going to turn next to education and language learning. First question comes from William from Arkansas here in the US. SDT recognizes schools are context for student flourishing, yet SDT-informed research in education does not seem to reflect this concept to focus on other outcomes like achievement over flourishing. What can SDT research in education do better?
Well, I think the standard SDT position has been that schools are really context for human development and for flourishing. They're not just achievement factories. And I think one of the critiques that we've had of standard public schools in the United States and in most countries today is that they're way too focused on a really narrow band of cognitive outcomes of achievement, often to the neglect of the needs of the diverse populations that they serve. I mean, kids come into school in all shapes and sizes and different interests and different intellective capacities. And schools should be serving all of those, not trying to funnel everybody through a very small gauntlet toward the same outcomes. I think less focus on achievement outcomes and more focus on meeting the basic psychological needs of children in the context of learning leads to greater, paradoxically, actually leads to greater achievement. So schools that are more attentive to supporting autonomy and competence in the classroom are the ones that actually have kids learn a lot more, I think, than schools that are using external controlling devices to try and get them to learn what's going to be on the next test. We've seen that, one of the, I think one of the, ongoing things that I've been trying to fight across the world is what we call high stakes testing, which is putting sanctions and rewards on schools for getting certain kind of test scores, which drives really the worst of classroom practices because it leads teachers to be more controlling in classrooms and then leads children to be less engaged because it's less interesting and less interactive. If we can get less focus on achievement outcomes and more focus on helping kids develop from whatever starting point they are coming from, I think we'll have better schools in which kids can flourish and, ironically, we'll also have better learning outcomes for those schools. There's been a lot of really bad policy in a lot of countries recently that I think actually backfires in terms of creating places of learning that are of high quality. And it's been a slow learning lesson. We've had now 25 years of high stakes testing in places like Europe and China and the United States and Australia here that has shown no real positive effects on kids' learning outcomes, let alone on their flourishing and well-being. So, we would say let's focus on creating high quality classrooms that are really need supportive classrooms, and we will have flourishing kids and better learning.
Great. This next question is from Maria from Copenhagen. She actually has two questions. Which, in your opinion, are the best ways to measure motivation and basic need fulfillment amongst students in higher education? And says, hopefully, a shorter scale.
Hopefully, a shorter scale. Yeah, scales are certainly one way we can measure that. I mean, there's a lot of different research methodologies, survey studies, observational studies, qualitative studies. That's one of the ships coming out here that's honking. So, there's no one way of measuring these things. There are some scales for basic psychological need satisfaction that have been adapted for higher education. I think the scale by Baiwen Chen and her colleagues, which has become kind of a standard measure of basic psychological needs satisfaction, can be adapted for the for higher education settings. But I think measuring through surveys basic psychological needs is one way to get at that. And you can certainly use some briefer questionnaires. I think the Chen standard measure is 24 items because it measures all three basic psychological needs, satisfactions and frustrations. But sometimes you can shrink that to be 12 items to get a pretty reliable signal on those things. So psychometrics is helping us a lot these days to use shorter questionnaires. And I think it's really important just because questionnaire fatigue also interferes with the validity of the answers we get. So I don't have a single answer for that. I would want to think about the context that you're trying to measure and what your goals are in particular research. But there are some pretty economical measures coming from the SDT community that you can apply.
She has a second question. What does Richard think about the biggest obstacles to creating higher education environments that really promote well-being?
Well, again, higher education environments, they themselves are pretty heterogeneous in character. So, we have people who are pursuing higher education for vocational reasons, and some for liberal arts just to kind of enhance themselves, and some for strongly professional reasons. So the reasons people are in higher education differ a lot. And plus, our institutions vary a lot in terms of what they're providing and what their own aims are. I guess when I think about the ideals of universities and what universities should really be after, I think it's really about helping a person develop holistically, to be a more critical thinker, to be more aware of what's going on in the societies around them, as well as to develop some skills that can help them flourish in life and find a good career. And I think a lot of higher education institutions have been way too focused on achievement outcomes and grading and career focus, and not enough on the development of the whole person. And if I was going to be creating myself a university setting, I would want to make sure that it was holistically focused on all aspects of the person, their physical development, their intellectual development, and their social development and capacities to interact with and respect other people. So creating community as well. Those are all proper goals and ideals of universities. And so there are a lot of pressures on universities, sometimes for rankings and sometimes for citations, and that those things can really be interfering with the university's other missions of helping their students develop holistically. And I think, we as professors are often under pressures that can drive us away from really caring for our students and taking their internal frame of reference and nurturing their development over time. So there's endless things that I can think of that our higher education institutions could do better. And I think each of us as professors, as faculty members, has some obligation to think about the environments we're providing for students and how we can make them richer and more supportive. That's kind of a not answering your question, because I think it'll come down to specifics of where you are and who your students are.
Mm-hmm. The next question comes from Suzanne from Denmark. I find the SDT very useful in my daily work as head of education at a technical and vocational college. At the moment, I'm doing a project on how to use games in my organization to develop the awareness on student satisfaction among teachers and technical staff. The theory of gamification builds upon knowledge of playing. What are the connections between playing and intrinsic motivation? Bring new perspectives on gamification.
Okay, we had a bit of a freeze during your question, so I'm not sure.
And we're just saying.
I heard the whole answer to it. So
I can repeat the question, but it is on gamification.
No, I think I've got the question.
Can you still hear me?
I can hear you. I don't know if you've got me. So I heard that question was really about gamification and whether it can increase intrinsic motivation for learning. And I know that the context was a technical school.
That's correct.
Intrinsic motivation, kind of the prototype of intrinsic motivation is play. So, children's play is inherently intrinsically motivating. They're learning about their environment when they're playing, and it's true throughout the lifespan that play and the kind of spontaneous interest associated with it is a vehicle for learning. And I think, in STT, we got interested in why people play video games, for instance, because first of all, you see people playing them a lot. So Scott Rigby and Andy Shabilsky and I started some research a long time ago, partly wanting to verify the principles of CET, cognitive evaluation theory, and STT in the domain of games. We assumed if people are really intrinsically motivated to play video games, it must be because video games are features in them that are supporting people's sense of competence, supporting their sense of autonomy, and supporting their sense of relatedness in those games. And so our analysis of video games really focuses on that. We have what we call the PENS model, the player experience of need satisfaction, and we know when features of games afford people a greater sense of autonomy. For instance, gives them choices over the activities that they engage in or the challenges that they seek, or gives them rich and dense competence feedback. These make the games more interesting and more engaging, and then there's more sustained behavior over time. I think a lot of people have seen the power of video games, and they want to kind of bring that power into their particular educational activities or training activities. And this is where the movement for gamification really comes from. Well, if games are doing so well, maybe if we take the features of games and stick them into our activities, we'll have people more engaged over time, more intrinsically motivated. And that's only true to the extent that the features you bring in from games really are intrinsically motivating in that context. I can bring in a leveling up feature into my workplace, but if it feels like it's evaluative and controlling, it's not going to have the positive impact it had in a gaming environment. I can give people choices, but if they don't see those choices as meaningful, that's not going to have the same impact. I guess the kind of classic example is in games, there's badges and awards and new levels, and but just slapping a bunch of new badges onto people's activities won't make it feel more fun. It actually might have the opposite effect. It might feel controlling. So gamification is in art. It's really thinking about what elements of games might actually contribute to the intrinsic motivation of people. And then when I bring in a new element that is a gaming element into my work or training or educational atmosphere, I want to pay attention to whether it's having the right functional significance. Is it really stimulating more interest, or is it just feeling like a manipulation? And I think the sad part is, I think we've seen a lot of misspent gamification efforts where people take features of games and put them on activities, and it just feels like, oh, you're just manipulating me to do more of this activity, and it actually has a backfiring effect. On the other hand, there's really good instances of gamification where people have made activities more fun through restructuring them with game features, and that's the positive outcome of it. So I hope that speaks to the question. It's not always good to gamify something.
Right, and I think that really does answer this question. Carmen from the US says, I'm conducting a study using STT as the framework along with critical race theory. The study is looking at Black students' motivation to pursue post-secondary education for my dissertation. Any advice on interviewing techniques to use or how to analyze the data with an STT lens?
Well, Shannon, I can't think of a more timely question than this one, given what's going on in the United States right now, and the Black Lives Matter movement, and a lot of the recognition, I think, right now that there is institutional racism at every level in our society. And this is what critical race theory is really intended to address. Critical race theory, at least in my understanding, is it goes beyond just the recognition that there is racism in the world to a deeper understanding that racism is built into our institutions in many ways, in ways that are often unrecognized and not made explicit by people. And critical race theory then attempts to kind of really reflectively decompose institutions to find out what it is about them that is either oppressive or liberating to everybody of all races. So I certainly think our educational institutions have built in racism into them. I see that in multiple countries. I see that here in Australia with our indigenous populations. I've certainly seen that in the United States in the educational system. Educational systems can be built in with certain biases or privileges for certain populations over others. And it's certainly true with respect to our higher education systems in the United States. So I think this is a really great area of study, first of all. And I think the SDT really does apply to this because we want to know in what way are our higher level institutions supporting the autonomy of Black individuals who are growing into them, of all individuals who are growing into them, but particularly Black individuals because they've been historically discriminated against in these institutions. And part of the SDT method would be really to take the internal frame of reference of the participants, meaning to be empathically interested in the obstacles as they're understood by the participants. So the students that you're interviewing, you really want to hear their perspective on what are the obstacles and the affordances that they're seeing in their environments that are either interfering with or supporting their motivation and engagement over time. And by paying close attention to that, we can help identify the features within the institutional structures that can be the most oppressive to people. I think that this, I hope this person really pursues this work because I think the interface of critical race theory and SDT is should be a very synergistic one, since the whole goal of SDT is supporting the autonomy of everybody, and that means we need to be critical and reflective about how our institutions are either doing that well or whether they're doing it poorly. I think the whole thrust of SDT is take any environmental context and analyze it in terms of how it's either obstructing or facilitating the basic psychological need satisfaction of the people who are in it. And so I'd be listening for that in my interview work and survey work.
These are just great questions, so I really appreciate Carmen asking this. The next question comes from Lebro Bao from Vietnam. It says, hi, I'm interested in applying SDT into learning English as a foreign language. I'd like to ask two questions. The first is, in developing intrinsic motivation, how could language learners be intrinsically motivated or internalized to learn a new language? And I think you can take the second one too, as how can we measure the autonomy, competence, and relatedness of students, teachers when they're learning or teaching English and using SDT?
Well, this area of research, second language learning and language learning is really, really active right now. And there's some really great researchers in SDT who are doing work that, I would appeal to those experts first. And this is people like Kimberly Knowles or Quint Oga-Baldwin and others who've been writing a lot on intrinsic motivation in language learning classrooms and how it can be promoted. Clearly there's some general principles that come from SDT of having autonomy supportive lessons, of having things that are really interesting and have a strong rationale behind them and that are really engaging. So, we see techniques that have to do with actually having people learn and use language rather than just memorize vocabulary lists and get tested on them. These are elements in classroom teaching that facilitate engagement and autonomy. But there are many, many specific ones, and I guess I would just refer the questioner to this really rich literature that's out there right now in this area. And I think we've posted a few articles on this recently on the website on second language learning and techniques in classrooms that are doing it. The Japanese government some time ago did an initiative where they realized that there wasn't as much success in the learning of English as they wanted to in their classrooms, and they started a movement to promote more intrinsic motivation in classrooms. And that's something that Quint Oga-Baldwin took a specific look at. Is that an effective way to go? And I think he found very positive evidence for The more we can introduce intrinsic motivation into the language learning context, particularly at early ages, the more successful we can be in promoting second language learning. And I know Kim Knowles has done a lot of similar work on that. So I would check out those and other researchers in this area because it's a very active part of SDT right now.
Great. We have another question in education, and this is the last in this section. It's from Jacob. How does SDT's argument in favor of autonomy support show up in a way you conduct your classrooms, pedagogy, and or personal relationships, both in terms of practices you consider to be empirically validated and any practices not yet validated that you have an intuition fit to be autonomy supportive?
Well, again, there's a lot of active research on just this topic, and here I think of people like John Marshall Reeve, who've actually done classroom interventions to support teachers becoming more autonomy supportive in classrooms, and ways in which they can do that, and work that's been going on in Ghent, looking at how to promote high autonomy, high structure classrooms. And the first thing I think of is the best classrooms in the educational environment are characterized by both high autonomy support and a high degree of structure, meaning children know, or learners know, what it is that they need to do. Their goals are clear, the criteria are clear, the activities are clear, so that they have a scaffolding that they can climb in which they can feel effective and get positive feedback. And also when they're engaged in activities, that there's an attempt to either make them interesting or relevant through providing strong rationale for why these things are useful and why these things are important. So classrooms where there's a high degree of relevance and rationale and interest value, and where there is pathways so that you can feel successful from where you start in terms of skills, are really kind of the essential ingredients of a positive classroom. But I also have to say, there's no good learning in a classroom where you can't feel connected, particularly to the instructor or to the other students in class. Relatedness is really important. And I've seen, I think it was Rashmi Kuskar and her group recently was doing some work on medical education. And one of the things that they were really stressing is that, first you need to create an atmosphere of relatedness and trust, and then when you start to provide rationale or to help people learn something new, they're more likely to internalize it and take it on. So again, there's a lot of specific techniques we could talk about in classrooms, but it begins by having respect for your learners, by paying attention to their frame of reference and experience as they're undergoing lessons, trying to be responsive to that experience, and then supplying a high degree of structure so that they know what it is that they need to do in order to be effective, and therefore get competence feedback so that they can stay motivated to keep at it and not withdraw and disengage. So I'm not sure I fully answered that question, but again, the general principles are pretty well laid out in SDT, and there's been really successful interventions to show that teachers can acquire the skills to become more autonomy supportive and to become more structured in classrooms, and then be successful in terms of outcomes.
I think it will be interesting too, and there will be new norms in education of more distance learning or remote learning. So I think the things you're talking about, Rich, are really applicable to even these times right now.
Yeah, I think particularly higher education, but I think all educational environments are going to be changing a lot. We're going to see a lot more distance learning. We're going to see a lot more flipped classrooms. These things are opportunities as well as challenges for us as educators. I think of the opportunity to have flipped classrooms where students can watch your lecture or listen to you talk on their own, in their own time, in their own flexible way, and then you can instead be spending your time more interactively and in an engaged way with your students to answer the questions or to help them with a specific skill. So things that seem like challenges to us now that we're kind of forced into remote learning can also help us be innovative and find new and better ways to be teaching in this modern world. I actually just saw a study that came out that applied some SDT in it, where many students found online learning from their instructors more satisfying than the more face-to-face classroom instruction, lecture format kind of instruction that they're used to having. In part because, you know, if you have something that's online, you can slow it down, you can watch it again, you can use it the way that you want to use it, and then you have other opportunities for interaction with instructors that are outside of that. So, you know, there's some possibilities that are coming out, some silver linings coming out of our forced change in how we teach.
Yeah, and I'm always amazed, Richard, that you're able to come up with another study and another study.
It's a sad life. It's a sad life. But I spend a lot of time reading the things that come out in the SDT community, and that's a formidable challenge because every day there are new studies coming out in every domain, and it's really hard to stay on top of them. I guess that's both a blessing and a curse from my point of view.
Yes, indeed.
And I'm sure in many of the questions that I'm answering today, there are really good answers from the SDT community that I'm not bringing to mind here at the moment, at now whatever time it is, 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning here. But I would always encourage people to be going to the CSDT website, where we try and put those resources up under every topic, because I'm sure there's better answers there than the things that I'm providing spontaneously right now.
That's great. Yes. Well, we're going to switch gears a little and delve into parenting questions. So this question, it's Wilbert he wanted to ask you another question. This is the same Wilbert from Hong Kong. He says, regarding raising a toddler 1 to 3 years old, how do parents provide autonomy support? I'm always trying to give choice, give reasons for my very young child. This is a two-part question, but take this one and then I'll read you the second one.
Oh, is there more to the question? Go ahead and finish the question.
Well, there's a second part. Well, it's not a second part. It's a second question on parenting. So Wilbur is very curious. I have two questions for you. So first one's on
first in this toddler period, there is a lot of really good research going on at the moment. And again, I'm going to point back to Muriel Josme and Margot, who've been looking at helping toddlers internalize parental rules and socializing them in early development, and how that is done through autonomy support and also through structure again. So how does one do that? Well, you know, I think autonomy support always begins with taking the frame of reference of your child. So, you know, your toddler has their own impulses, their own urges, their own desires, and of course you want to be as responsive to those as you can. That's helping them to promote their curiosity and their exploration. At the same time, one of the challenges of toddlers is they have to begin to internalize limits on their behavior, to know the things that they can't touch, or the times when they can't go outside, or they can't be in the swimming pool, or whatever the particular thing is in your house. So setting limits on kids means empathically providing them a structure, giving them reasons for why you're enforcing something that's frustrating to them, at the same time acknowledging the frustrations and the blocks, and then trying to provide choices for them within the constraints that you can, so that they can have other outlets. You know, I think, for instance, you have a toddler and it's time to give them a bath and they don't want to take a bath. You can be explaining that now is the time for taking a bath, and so you bring them into the bath, but you give them choices about what toys they can bring into the tub, so they can feel some empowerment and not just feel like they're being forced into something without any sense of control that's in it. That both helps them comply with the behavior, but at the same time, it gives them some opportunity to feel voice and choice in a situation. There are many limits that we have to set on kids, and we have to keep them protected, and they don't get to choose whatever they want. Probably one of the worst parenting styles researched by SDT is what we call permissive parenting, which is you just give in to everything that your toddler wants. That creates chaos for you, but it also isn't a way of helping your toddler develop the executive skills and self-regulatory skills that they're going to need for society later on. So toddlerhood begins the challenge of parenting, of helping kids internalize a willing compliance with the things that are helpful for them to internalize. And that's done through respecting them, through supporting their autonomy, at the same time as being pretty clear on what the guidelines and rules are for behavior. If you get into fights with your toddler, I think it's always good for the parents to reflect on, do I really need to be doing this thing right now? Why am I pushing something on my toddler? Is there another time I might be able to do that? Because toddlers do have their own needs. So I think there's something about parents being reflective themselves. We often have our wants that are sometimes also out of place. So, it's not an easy job to be a parent, Wilbert. But I think SDT does supply some good perspectives on how we can do that well. It always begins with empathy for your kid.
Yeah, so Wilbert's got more questions on this for you. So and this is going to be, I understand reward and punishment has an undermining effect. However, behavioral modification is widely used in parenting. So when do we teach very young kids, 2 to 6, by reward and punishment? How would SDT parents shape their children's behavior?
I don't think SDT has any place for punishment, at least as classically conceived. There's been no positive evidence, for instance, that corporal punishment has ever served internalization well or leads to more compliant children. I don't think that's true. So I don't think we would ever advocate punishment. On the other hand, rewards is a much more complicated thing, because you can use rewards in a controlling way, or you can use rewards in a way that acknowledges jobs well done by your child. And so I think rewards can be used to support positive feedback and competence. But if you're using them to manipulate your child into doing something, I think you're setting yourself up for some real difficulties. One of the problems with behavior modification is that rewards can be powerfully controlling of children's behavior, but then their behavior becomes dependent upon the receipt of rewards. And that's usually not what parents want. They want them to internalize the capacity to regulate their behavior, not to be dependent on the parent having the carrot in front of them. So if my child only behaves in the store if I'm giving them ice cream, that's not a good thing for your child to be learning. And that means that, the moment the ice cream's not out there, they're not complying with you in the store. So rewards and punishments as a strategy for socialization are really, they have a lot of collateral costs, and they're not all that effective. Much more effective is helping your child internalize limits and new behaviors. And that comes about through providing them with a real rationale, giving them strong support for autonomy, understanding their perspective, reflecting and acknowledging the conflicts they might have with what it is that they need to do, and then providing them choice within the activity to the extent that that's possible. So our classic approach to limit setting, I think, is really an effective thing. I think research has shown that it's effective in producing more committed compliance. It takes some effort on the standpoint of parents, but I think the payoff is high for them, because the reward and punishment approach means you have a kid who's going to misbehave whenever you're not monitoring it, and that has its own set of costs.
I can relate to Wilbert's questions, because I have a 4-year-old, as you know, and I've always appreciated, at one time you told me when I was asking similar questions as Wilbert, you said around rewards. If you use rewards, you might have won the battle, but you've lost the war. And that has really stuck with me. So I'm passing that along to Wilbert because I really found that helpful when you do, it's so easy to think of just giving a reward to kind of get something some kind of behavior that you're needing at the time.
I think just as we're speaking about this, we have to have a lot of empathy for parents. I think a lot of parenting, particularly kids at that age, is pretty can be emotionally draining. It takes a lot of attention, and it can be tiring and depleting to parents. And a lot of the controlling behaviors I see parents committing really often come out of frustration and fatigue that they have. So I think we can be empathic that sometimes it's going to happen. One of the things that we've seen in the developmental literature is you see a lot in that age group, you see parents doing some controlling things and some autonomy supportive things at the same time, and it's probably not that ecologically unexpected. So also, Wilbert, be compassionate with yourself, be self-forgiving. Kids can be sometimes frustrating. It's really great if you have another parent available to you to support you during those times. Sometimes it's good for a parent to give themselves a time out in moments of frustration and let another parent take over. Not everybody has another partner to help them with that. So it's not always a strategy. So, but sometimes we have to give ourselves time out and self-compassion in the context of raising kids. So, be kind to yourself, Wilbert.
The next question comes from Ib from Denmark. What does SDT say about gender differences, say in the parenting of infants? If gender issues haven't been researched much in SDT yet, as is my impression, why might that be?
Have gender issues not been researched? I think it was right here that I haven't seen a lot of specific research on gender differences in, or at least early socialization. I think there's a lot of work on gender differences in SDT, but maybe not in that developmental period that I've seen. Because I think in part the strategies for parenting are the same for children of both genders, which is you want to be supporting their autonomy and their confidence and their relatedness in that early age. If there are inherent gender differences, that does suggest that there might be some differences in interests or activities that children take on. And I think that's kind of an empirical question as to the extent that's true or when those appear. I do know that socialization has an impact on these. There's a kind of a stage when children attain what's called gender constancy, somewhere around 3 years old, when they start to realize that they are a girl or a boy, and that has certain implications for them. But those implications are often contextual in your society. What is your society saying girls do or boys do? I think, one of the things I would just stress is I think it's important for parents to be responsive to whatever interest your child's had, even whether it's gender matching or not, because kids are diverse and they're going to grow up in different ways and they're going to become the people they are. And I think our society is often too gendered in the sense of trying to get boys to act like boys or get girls to act like girls to the detriment of their human development. So I would just be careful about that. But I think you're right. There's not been enough research on whether there are different gendered related differences in early development that might require different responses from parents, but I haven't seen any evidence to that effect. I think it's the same approaches are pretty important for both genders.
Well, now we're going to turn to another life domain, and that's the one of work. And the first question comes from Rodrigo from Argentina. From your point of view, are companies paying enough attention and working on SDT principles in order to have people motivated and productive? Is there a case you could tell us about?
Well, I think organizations have changed a lot over the past couple of decades. I mean, they've moved from much more of a carrot and stick philosophy that you're going to motivate people through controlling the incentivization that they have for certain activities, or punish or sanction them for the things that they don't do, holding them accountable, high evaluation, high reward punishment structures. And I think modern organizations have found that that's not the most effective way of keeping employees engaged and contributing the most that they can. In fact, it's kind of the opposite of that. I think if we find that it's enlightened management structures are those that are trying to support the autonomy of their employees, understand their perspectives. That means that when they set goals for employees and And they give them a good rationale for why those goals are important. They give them the flexibility they need to accomplish those goals. And then they have a good manager who's attuned to obstacles. So rather than being evaluative or giving incentives for performance, I'm watching performance with my employee. And then when they're running into obstacles, I take interest in that. I would go to my employee and say, I see we're not reaching the goals that we had set out. Can you tell me what's going on around that, so that you can learn from them what obstacles they're facing? Part of the reasons I think autonomy supportive techniques in management are so much more effective is they also help managers diagnose and solve problems that are going on in the company. If you just try and, if your employees are not meeting their goals and you just get out a bigger carrot or reward structure for them, or get out a bigger stick or a punishment, you still haven't found out why they're having trouble reaching the goals. Much more important is being in touch with your employees. Maybe they don't have a good rationale. Maybe they don't understand why the goal is important. Maybe they haven't seen its place in the overall mission of the company. Maybe there's something structural in the job design that's in their way. Maybe there's something about the information or resources they need to meet the demands that they're making. And you're going to be in a much better position to diagnose and work on that problem if you're understanding the perspective and the struggles that your employee is facing. So I think that's one of the reasons why autonomy supportive management is so much more effective than the kind of controlling carrot and stick management. This also comes back to even how we do evaluations. A lot of data has shown that the more we evaluate employees on very narrow criteria, the more they only orient to those criteria, and they might engage in a lot of other behaviors that are organizationally deviant or not the best citizenship they can have, because they see the only thing that matters to my managers is this outcome, and they let other parts of their job go. More holistic evaluation, understanding the whole contribution your employee makes and then the areas that they can continue to grow is really an important part of management. I think another thing we see is that people change jobs a lot more now. They're not in the same company for their whole lives. And if we want to retain good talent, we have to make jobs satisfying to people and engaging to people, and places where they can see that there's a pathway to growth. And so I think competence support within organizations, helping people to continue to feel like they're learning, they're exercising new skills, they're seeing that there's ways in which they can be increasingly growing within a company or contributing to a company, really, really important. And I can't say enough about the importance of relatedness in organizations. Everybody works better for a manager who they feel likes them, who cares about them. You want to contribute to an organization that you feel is also something that you matter in and you belong to. So all three basic psychological needs really matter in engaging employees and, I guess, getting the best out of them. That's when we have companies that really care about their employees flourish, and in flourishing, they want to give more to their companies. And that makes the company more profitable. So it turns out that the SDT techniques for management are not only better for employees flourishing, but they're also better for companies meeting the KPIs that are central to them. So the performance outcomes that they really aspire to.
Henk from the Netherlands wants to know, what do you think about self-managing teams in relation to SDT? What is the most dominant element? Autonomy, relatedness, or competence?
Well, self-managing, I mean, this is a really pertinent question in this day and age where a lot of people are working remotely. They're not in the office in the same way that they could be monitored by managers in the past. So remote work requires a lot more self-management.
We'll just stand.
Oh, excuse me. We having a break up here? Shannon, can you hear me?
Your picture is great.
How about my voice?
Okay. You're back with us. You're back with me.
Okay, the question had to do with self-managing teams. And so I just wanted to say, I think it's a really important question, particularly in a time when many more people are working remotely and not in the office, because a lot more self-management is required. But the question was, which is most important, autonomy, competence, or relatedness for self-management teams? And I'm going to go back to my standard answer, which is they're all important for self-management teams. Self-management teams requires a lot of self-regulation. It means that you have to know what your goals are. You need to kind of mobilize your own energy to get to those goals, and that often requires a lot of flexibility in your job, because you have to manage your energy and your resources toward that end. So I think autonomy support comes in providing people with flexibility and not micromanagement. I think the opposite of that flexibility is I try and micromanage my team to get to goals, and that's going to interfere with their capacities to reach them in the most optimal manner, particularly if they're working remotely. Self-management teams also requires a lot of structure. So it's great to have people self-managing, but they need to know what the goals are and what standards is that they're trying to reach. And so goal clarity is really, really important. And when people aren't meeting goals, to be able to get feedback about that so that they can orient and recenter in ways that have them achieving what's needed. And self-management teams need to stay connected, both to share resources and information and effective ways of doing things, but also to maintain the spirit of working. If you're working too much in isolation, it can be really dispiriting over time. So I can't say that any one need is more important than others, although the very concept of self-management means there needs to be support for autonomy, because self-management requires that you have the initiative, you have the willingness, you have the discipline to carry out what you need to do, and that requires a different kind of oversight that's not controlling in nature.
I think those are great pointers for what we're all figuring out as we work in remote environments.
Yeah.
And the next question comes from Louis from the Netherlands. What do you think of not putting too much focus on hours while working, a day, a week? Should we consider more flexibility and autonomy during our workday and week? And would that be beneficial or not for the feeling of autonomy?
Well, it's an interesting question. Every organization has its own goals and its own needs. So there are some organizations where you really need to have people together in the workplace in certain hours to accomplish certain goals. Like, you can't make a movie remotely. Everybody has to be on the set at certain times, and there's not flexibility about that because the tools and the resources for the lighting and the costumes and the cameras need to be there. If you're manufacturing something, there's a certain core set of people who need to be there at a certain time to manufacture that. So we can't say it's always the case that people can work flexibly or have flexible hours in every respect. But a lot of companies are finding that flexibility in hours is actually really highly motivating to people, that people can make really good decisions about when they have the energy and when they have the resources to do their work, and then they accomplish a lot during those hours. So where we can give people flexibility in time, I think that typically turns out to be an advantage, and that's why you see a lot of corporations affording their employees that flexibility in work. Right now, where a lot of companies have to have people working remotely, they certainly need flexibility, because when you're working remotely, let's say that you're Shannon Hofen Sarasoli and you're working in your home, there's going to be demands in the home, your child and other kinds of things that are going to come up that you need to attend to that. But if you have the flexibility to attend to that, then you can find and carve out hours later when you can get your job done. So I think in this day and age, what we call management by objectives, having people know what goals it is that they have to reach giving them feedback about how well they're doing to reach those goals, but giving them the flexibility and autonomy to accomplish that in the best way possible from their own point of view is really, really an effective style of management. So I think we're going to see a lot more of this. So when we look at the future of work, I think one of the things people are discovering as an aspect of the coronavirus is we don't need to have the old everybody in the office at 9 and work till 5 model as the only effective model. There's a lot of discovery that people can work really well remotely or at home or during flex hours. And so I just think that's going to increasingly be what characterizes effective organizations in the future. And it has to do with employee empowerment rather than employee control.
I like, especially that last part, Rich. I think that's kind of a take-home message there. The next question is from Ian from Sydney, from where you're at. At what point do distal factors become more or less important for autonomy support? For example, in a work context, you have proximal effects like task design. More distal, you have workplace rules, environment, and organizational vision. Again, you have capitalist norms which shape the need to work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. As a practitioner, where do you focus your energy in nested complex systems like this?
Well, first of all, Ian, appreciate your being in Sydney here. As you see, we're having a really nice sunny winter day together here. This is the second or third day of winter here. It doesn't look like it for many people outside, but this is winter here in Sydney. So hi, Ian. Most large organizations are nested in just the way that Ian points out here. There's both your proximal job design, the particular demands and resources that you have on your own job, and management structure you have right in front of you. And then you have the overall climate of your company. It's the company's mission, the rules and the guidelines of the company itself, and both of those have a strong effect on employees. I think what the data shows is the most important impact on any employee's motivation is their immediate management. So your own manager's style in terms of being controlling or autonomy supportive, or showing relatedness and care versus being distant and hard to reach. These things really have an impact on employee motivation and engagement. So I think managerial styles play a huge role in retaining employees and retaining talent, and also in helping people stay engaged in their jobs. But I think the overarching climate of a company also has an impact. The distal factors that you spoke about, the kind of norms and style of the company itself, and even what the company's mission is. So, for instance, in our work at Motivation Works as consultants, we found that there are beyond the direct effects of your immediate managers, your what you're calling the proximal context. People have a belief that the company has an overarching good mission, that it doesn't only care about the people who are up in the executive suites and doesn't only care about the stockholders, but also cares about employees and cares about customers and cares about the community, then employees are more engaged in their job. We sometimes measure this as pride in companies. When people can have pride in what their company and organization is up to and the way it operates, they can be more invested and committed to their jobs. And that has a direct effect over and above the effect of the climate created by your own immediate manager. At the immediate level is also job design. And so, if I'm a manager and I'm seeing that there's some issues going on for my employees, some of that might be just how was the design of their job matched with their skills and the time and the demands that are made on them. So you always want to be listening to your employees. You always want to be sensitive to what's going well and what's going wrong, and adjusting the proximal environment to be optimizing to basic psychological need satisfaction. But it doesn't preclude paying attention to the overall company climate, how compensation systems work, how benefits are working, how perceptions of who's getting the profits, and are those being equitably shared, and is there procedural justice? These things all really matter in companies a lot for employees. And again, there's a lot of really good research going on in SDT on this from many different quarters. I mentioned here just a few people, Marilyn Gagne in Perth, and Jacques Forrest in Canada, and the Ghent Group working on organizations. There's just a lot of people. Anja van den Broek who's doing some great work in organizations and need satisfaction in organizations. Anja Olafsson in Norway. There's just many, many people who are doing good work in this area. And I also point to my partner, Scott Rigby, who does a lot of online lectures on structuring organizations and how you can have them be maximally motivating to people. So lots of resources within SDT on both the issue of proximal and distal elements in companies that facilitate motivation and wellness.
Great. This is our last question for the work section, and this comes from Anne in California. Do you see a role for SDT in diversity and inclusion initiatives? My SDT needs play an essential role in building inclusive work environments. My women's and men's needs be satisfied in different ways at work. Are you aware of any research being done in this area?
Well, the first thing I'd say is our own data shows that more inclusive work environments are more motivating to everybody, not just to underrepresented groups, but also to everybody in the organization. Some of the this is just a free association to this question, but some of the findings we've had in motivation work show that when you see somebody being treated in a non-inclusive manner, or somebody being treated in a biased manner, or somebody whose needs are not being met, it's not just affecting that person, it affects everybody who observes it happening. So if you see discrimination in the workplace, it affects everybody in the workplace, because it seems now like you have a less just and less good management style, and it takes away from your ability to engage in the company. But getting to Anne's broader question here, I think it was how does SDT management style relate to inclusiveness and diversity? And of course, the fundamental principle of management from an SDT point is autonomy support. And autonomy support means taking the perspective of all of your employees and respecting them as individuals. And that is in itself a more inclusive approach to employees. I think when we have more autonomy supportive management, we're more aware of all the needs of our diverse employees, and we can be more inclusive and more and help all of them stay engaged in the company. So I think there is evidence that autonomy supports diversity. People come into our organizations with different personalities, as you say, with different genders, and the interests that can go along with those. They come in with different needs as a result of such factors. Autonomy supportive management helps us address all of those diverse needs, and then keep a broader umbrella of people that we can have in our companies. So I think there's pretty good evidence that there's better employee retention when you have a needs supportive management environment, and part of that is, of course, you're keeping a more inclusive workplace.
That's a great question and great response.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. I think, one of the things we see is that you have a more inclusive workplace, you have a better workplace, because when you can get different points of view into your workplace, you're probably going to have a more creative and innovative place. One of the things I've seen just anecdotally is, we see when boards have more women on the corporate boards, companies can be more responsive to their whole audiences and to their whole workplace thing. So that increased diversity in corporate boards, I think, improves the management of companies. I think in every way, when we can have more diversity, we can be more appreciative of all the people we're trying to serve in an organization, both within the organization and then our customer base as well.
Great. Well, we have just a couple of questions on sport and then a few miscellaneous questions. So we're getting close to the finish line.
Because I need more coffee soon, so okay.
We'll get a sip. I'll get a sip of water. This is water. Just it is evening here though. So the first question in sport is from Jody Lee from Georgia. Her question is, thinking about sport in education context, I'd like to know a little bit more about the application of punishment and discipline from an SDT perspective. Clearly, punishment is typically applied in a controlling manner. How can we better educate coaches and teachers to provide discipline in an autonomy supportive way?
Well, sports does require discipline. We think of sports as highly intrinsically motivated, and certainly it is. You know, people play sports because it's fun. But to become really good at a sport, it requires that you also do training. It often involves routines. It also involves skill building and kind of regular working out that may not always be intrinsically motivating. And in SDT, we don't think of that as much as a problem of discipline as we think of it as internalization and self-regulation. So I think it's helping your athletes understand the importance of the various exercises and training that they have to do, and having them have good reasons to incorporate that into their lives and their efforts. And so, you know, like all other discussions we've had today about internalization, you do that by conveying the rationale for why your athletes need to do X, Y, or Z. When they see obstacles to that, you listen to those obstacles and help them overcome those obstacles or address those obstacles. And you try and make the training as interesting and as engaging as possible as a coach. One of the things that's been really interesting is how I think a lot of old school coaches think that if you don't use a lot of carrot and stick, that you can't get the most out of your athletes. But that's not what the data is showing. The data is showing that actually more autonomy supportive coaching techniques have people stay in sports longer, seem to be equally effective, if not more effective, at getting performance out of your athletes, and probably are associated with less things like injury, because you can pay more attention to yourself and the obstacles that you're facing. You can voice those with your coach. You can get help with the things that you need. In a way, I think it's a more effective coaching style, and it also helps team members be more helpful to each other because they're not as internally competitive. So there's just a lot of advantages in that kind of coaching techniques that have been advocated from SDT over the traditional. And of course, it's what I was exposed to as an athlete when I was young, the traditional, coach with the clipboard, the whistle, and the stick out there trying to motivate you, which can lead to a lot of disengagement and I think withdrawal from sports. You lose talent.
Yeah. The next question is from Laura from Liverpool, England. What are your thoughts on the impact and challenges that may be faced when applying SDT within a high performance sport environment?
Well, I think we were just speaking to some of those. A high performance sport environment is an environment in which goes beyond just we're having fun here, but we also have high demands, and there's a lot of training requirements in it. This takes discipline. This takes self-regulation, and you want to be finding ways to support your athletes for engaging in that kind of training. And again, that requires strong rationale. So explaining why certain things are important, putting, I think, though, innovation and change and alteration in there so you can stay interested. Don't make everything all about routines. Find new ways of getting people to engage in the kinds of training that they need to engage in, and exercise that they need to engage in. And then not putting so much pressure on winning as putting pressure on doing the best that you can do and doing well. Because even in a high performance atmosphere, the pressure on outcomes can be really demoralizing. So you want to be able to see progress as much as you can, and then also to be sympathetic to the obstacles that your high performance athletes are meeting. high performance athletes also are exposed to a lot of situations that inspire what we call ego involvement. You are in the public eye, your performance is noticed by people. If your self-esteem gets hooked really strongly on that, it can lead to a lot of ups and downs in athletes, and again, withdrawal from the sport or failing to sustain the motivation that it requires to stay at that high level. So helping your athletes find the intrinsic satisfactions in the sport, not getting too hooked on ego is really, really important in this context of high performance athletes as well. The differences between performance and high performance athletes, it's the difference between a winner and a loser is such a minute thing. So the kind of training that's involved in high performance sports is pretty intense. And so it requires sustained motivation over time. And that's why the old carrot and stick approach can really kind of backfire for coaches, and why I think SDT's had such an impact in the coaching world of late.
That's very much true. We're seeing a lot more applied work and research in this area.
Yeah. Seeing a lot of professional teams adopting self-determination theory principles into coaching because it's effective. And it's also more satisfying both to coaches and to their athletes. Coaches have a better relationship with their athletes, so it's more satisfying to be a coach as well.
Well, we have 3 questions left for you, Richard. So I don't think we've stumped you yet, but can you hang with us for another 3 questions?
Well, it's Saturday morning here, so I have the time. So let's proceed.
This question is from Brittany from Florida. We talk a lot about income disparity and how that affects development, mental health, and even physical health. As another component of this, is there often lack of meaningful communication between people of different SES, socioeconomic, I'm blanking on the S, socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
How can SDT inform our communication styles so that we are need supportive of people of both higher and lower SES than ourselves?
Well, Brittany, I guess the first thing is that there has been evidence from within SDT that income inequality does have a negative impact on people's well-being at all levels of income, and that impact is mediated by basic psychological needs. Stefano Di Domenico and others have done some of that work, showing that in areas where there's high income inequality, in a way everybody suffers, and this is consistent with the work by Wilkinson and others in this area. So why does income inequality affect us negatively? Well, in one sense, I think, Brittany, you pointed out, which is it separates us from one another. It leads us into social comparisons, and it leads us into self-protective modes. So even if I'm a very wealthy person in an area where there are poor people, now I've got to protect myself from them. I've got to, put up my gated community, or I've got to do things that now separate me from the other people and make me less connected to them. And then, of course, it leads to resentment and feelings of failure on the people who are on the other end of that stick. So income inequality affects all of us because it divides our society. And so, from a social policy point of view, having less exaggerated income inequality is really going to be good for the basic psychological needs satisfaction and welfare of all people. We recently submitted a study that was drawn from European Social Sciences Survey across 27 countries, and we were able to show that both income and income inequality do predict well-being outcomes in those countries as a function of basic psychological needs satisfaction. So this is a huge thing. I think one of the things that I've been impressed by in data on socioeconomic status and treatment of others is how wealthy people tend to be less giving than poorer people, less empathic than poorer people. And this has something to do, I think, with the internalization of values in certain kinds of Anglo-American capitalist atmospheres, which is somehow if I have to keep it away from you, or that you're somehow lesser of a person because you have less income. And so that mistreatment just seems to be I mean, it's counterintuitive for a lot of people. You would think that the more resources you have, the more you could afford to be empathic and caring for others, but it turns out to be opposite of that. You know, I think a principle of SDT is that we support and respect the dignity of everybody, regardless of their socioeconomic status. We care and take interest in the frame of reference of everybody else. And if we can appreciate the frame of reference of everybody, no matter what their status is around us, we'll come to more connectedness. You know, so if I'm a person who has less than you do, I think it's nice if you can listen to my perspective on that and share in the obstacles and struggles that I have. At the same time, you know, I can understand the perspectives that you have. So when we share in our perspectives, when we communicate more, when we take the internal frame of reference of others, our whole society becomes more connected and compassionate. So that's a pretty abstract answer to that question. You know, I go back to structurally, we need to do some things to decrease the exaggerated income inequality we're seeing in a lot of societies today, because, you know, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And that's not helping our social cohesion in any way, shape, or form, or the wellness of people at every level of society. So we can do something structurally about that. But personally, it's always about appreciating differences, not being judgmental of other people, but coming to them with an open framework and an interested framework and a mindful framework in our interactions. And you know, those are some things that just come to mind. So it's a great question. I wish I had even a less abstract answer for you.
Well, we're going to get to this next question. This is from Denmark again. It says, can SDT be used to manipulate people? If so, how do you guard against that?
Well, SDT is a set of principles for how to motivate people well. And sometimes people will look for a set of principles and then try and use it to manipulate people. So any technique can be used to manipulate people. I think here of, for instance, motivational interviewing is a wonderful therapeutic strategy for supporting the autonomy of others. And part of it means, you know, getting people to reflect on discrepancies between their own current behavior and maybe some ideals or goals they would want to reach. But I've seen therapists use the reflection on discrepancy in a manipulative manner. So they bring out the discrepancy they want you to reflect on because they're trying to motivate you to close that gap. Here, an autonomy supportive technique in principle is being used in a manipulative and controlling manner. It comes back to the idea that a lot of what control is about is what is your intent when you're using a technique? Am I using a technique from SDT as a way of pressuring people or getting people to a certain outcome? If that's the case, then I'm using it in a controlling manner and it's likely to backfire. The whole idea is that you want to embrace the philosophy that underpins autonomy support, which is really caring about the perspective of the person you're trying to motivate and understanding the obstacles as they see them and helping them through that. That's not manipulative. That's helping somebody flourish. That's being nourishing. So I think we want to. I would say, yeah, we worry a lot about can you use SDT techniques to manipulate others? I think you can, but I think it'll only work in the short run because people are pretty sensitive to when techniques are being used to manipulate. So if you give me superficial choices as a way of trying to promote my autonomy and keep me engaged, but I see those choices as simply meaningless or as like bells and whistles being thrown in to get me to work more, they're not going to have the intended effect. So it comes back to the fundamental principle of functional significance in SDT, which is when I use a technique, does it feel controlling to the person I'm using it on, or does it feel like it's supporting their autonomy? And I want to be paying attention to that as a motivator, because that's going to be really important in what outcomes accrue.
I think that's a great question from Ib, and yeah. This is our last question. This is from Debbie in Virginia. She wants to know, what was your Newton's apple tree moment for founding SDT? Was there an observational moment in discovering the SDT principles of motivation?
Newton's apple moment. So, Newton's apple moment, I guess, refers to when apple fell on his head and he discovered gravity.
Right, gravitational forces.
I guess the question is for Ed, DC, or for me or anybody else in SDT, has there been a moment when the apple fell on our head and said, basic psychological needs are really, really important? Um, I'll say this. I know that when we started our work in the 1970s, both Ed and I came together on the viewpoint that most of motivation psychology was oriented towards how can we manipulate people from the outside with rewards and punishments to get them to do X, Y, or Z. And we saw that as really not just a controlling approach, but it was kind of missing a fundamental point about human beings, which is that human beings are naturally active. They naturally want to accomplish things. They would like to contribute to their societies. They'd like to feel like they matter. And our question then was not how can we manipulate them to do those things, but rather how can we support them for doing those things? How can we facilitate the internal motivation that is already there in people? So I wouldn't say that was a kind of apple falling on our heads, but we shared that sensibility as clinicians and psychologists, and wanted to build a psychology that was built around that understanding of a proactive, vital human nature and how it can be supported. But SDT's grown. I wrote an article recently with Ed that was called the brick by brick. It's not that it's been kind of one apple falling on our heads, but it's been like one apple falls and we explore what the meaning of that is, and then another apple falls because of that exploration. But it's been a slowly expanding theory based on convergent evidence. So when we were first working, we were studying the principles of what supports intrinsic motivation, but we pretty quickly moved to the study of extrinsic motivation and how that could be internalized to be now autonomously engaged in and self-motivated. And when we were looking at the conditions that supported both intrinsic motivation and internalizations, we found that when people were getting their basic psychological needs met, not only were they more motivated, but they also had greater wellness, and that led to basic psychological need theory. And from there we expanded into other mini theories that we have. So not one apple, but a series of apples falling on our heads and then the heads of all of our collaborators around the world. At this point, SDT is made up of thousands of researchers around the world. As we saw at the last international conference, there are many people who are using the framework to expand knowledge. And so I'm seeing apples falling all the time on the heads of investigators within our field, and I think that's why SDT is the vital area of research and practice and intervention that it is today. So, no single apple, but hopefully it's been a really good tree out of which apples keep falling. So I think SDT community, let's keep shaking that tree.
Oh, what a great way to end our Q&A today.
That's it. We're done.
We're done. Well, I would like to say just a few I'm sure you've got a few little things you might want to say that come to mind, but I do want to thank everyone out there that submitted questions to us. I also want to thank our members of the CSDT community. And thank you, Richard, for doing this and answering all these questions today. And also to some of our other supporters like Immersive Inc., who helps us, do productions like this and supports CSDT as well as others. So.
Yeah, I think, Shannon, if I can just reflect on the work that you're doing in Celebration, Florida with CSDT, the purpose of CSDT is to disseminate information and practices that stem from the theory. And of course, that's partly why we're doing the Q&A today. This is a pretty informal Q&A. It was just an opportunity to answer to field some questions from abroad. So, we can also be offering some more formal programs and some more, I think, targeted Q&As as we've done in the past. So do let Shannon know what it is you'd like to see CSDT doing. And those of you who can do it, please help support CSDT through your membership or your sponsorships of our work. we give everything away we can for free. That's the notion of CSDT, is the free dissemination of the knowledge that our whole community develops. So to the extent you can participate in that, please do, both by telling us what you want and then also supporting us as you can. And Shannon, thanks a lot today for both collecting questions and then presenting it to me. I wish I was a little more awake this morning to answer these things, but I hope I've given some decent answers in the context of this Q&A.
I think you have, Richard. And as always, it's great doing this. And I always hear from people afterwards that they really do enjoy these Q&A sessions. So
well, we were doing them more regularly, and we were doing them on targeted topics before, and I know it's been a long time, so this was a particularly long one and a particularly varied set of questions. So hopefully we'll be doing some more specific programs in the future now that we know how to connect from such great distances. So.
Well, take care, everyone. Be safe, and we'll see you again soon.